It's 1925. The Chicago air buzzes with the sound of jazz and the smell of new money. You've finally made it. You bought your dream home in a respectable neighborhood, with tree-lined streets and neighbors who tip their hats in the morning. And speaking of neighbors, the man next door is the talk of the town, a fellow named Al Capone. He's the picture of success. Flawless silk suits, a broad smile, and a generosity that's almost unbelievable, handing out $100 bills to kids on the street like they're candy. He seems like the perfect neighbor, proof that the American dream is real. But look closer. Notice the luxury cars with tinted windows that never turn off their engines. Feel the sudden silence from your other neighbors whenever his name is mentioned. See the broad-shouldered, cold-eyed men who surround him, whose coats can't quite hide the bulge of a gun. You haven't moved next to a businessman. You've moved into the epicenter of an earthquake of crime, power, and violence that's about to swallow the city whole. And all that generosity, it's just the bait. Today, we're pulling back the curtain of smoke and mirrors to show you why living next to Al Capone wasn't a dream, but a sentence, and why you most certainly would not survive it. Imagine waking up every morning in your modest home in Park Manor, Chicago. The year is 1925. The city pulses with a feverish energy, a mix of jazz, ambition, and the clinking of new money. And right there, in the house next door at 7244 South Prairie Avenue, lives the epicenter of this energy. Your neighbor, Alphonse Capone. To the world, and especially to you, he is not the monster history would later record. He is Mr. Capone, a family man, a successful entrepreneur in the second-hand furniture business, as he likes to say with a wink. The first impression is one of overwhelming charisma. He is often seen in the front yard with his son Sonny, teaching him how to throw a baseball. His wife May is a quiet, gentle presence, always offering a friendly wave. Capone himself seems like a pillar of the community. During the Great Depression, he would become famous for opening soup kitchens that fed thousands of the unemployed. You see him handing out dollar bills to street kids, paying the medical bills for a family in need, ensuring no one goes through Christmas without a turkey on the table. He is generous to the point of being almost unbelievable. A true modern-day Robin Hood, as some newspapers are beginning to call him. He projects an image of order and stability in a chaotic city. A man who, despite his humble origins, has achieved the American dream. But the daily routine, observed more closely from your kitchen window, begins to paint a different picture, one with strokes of darkness beneath the bright canvas. The normality of suburban life is constantly punctured by anomalies that send a chill down your spine. The cars, for instance, they aren't the ordinary Ford Model Ts your other neighbors drive. They are custom-built Cadillacs and Lincolns, with reinforced glass and engines that are never turned off. Even when parked for hours in front of the house, they arrive and depart at strange hours, long after midnight, gliding silently down the street like steel sharks. The people who visit Mr. Capone are another red flag. They are not salesmen or distant relatives. They are broad-shouldered men with fedoras pulled down low, whose heavy coats, even in the summer heat, can't quite conceal the outline of a shoulder holster. They never smile. Their eyes scan the street with a cold, professional vigilance. The conversations you overhear, fragments carried on the wind, are not about the furniture business. They are harsh whispers about territory, shipments, and lessons to be taught. There's something strange about his trash, too. Crates upon crates of the finest liquor, Canadian whiskey, French champagne, at a time when prohibition makes owning a single bottle a federal crime. The sound that sometimes comes from his basement late at night isn't of tools fixing a broken chair. It's a dull, muffled thud followed by a heavy, dense silence. The people who enter his house, especially those who look nervous or defiant, are not always seen leaving through the front door. Your first direct contact with him is a test of nerves. Perhaps your child accidentally kicked a ball onto his immaculate lawn. You go to retrieve it hard in your throat, expecting a reprimand. Instead, the door opens and there he is, Al Capone in the flesh. He smiles, a wide, genuine grin, and hands the ball back with a laugh. "Don't you worry about it, neighbor. Kids will be kids," he says, his voice deep and surprisingly calm. He invites you in, offers you a glass of the finest whiskey you've ever tasted, asks about your family, your job. He is charming, attentive, making you feel like the most important person in the world. But then, for an instant, the smile doesn't reach his eyes. You see a frigid glint, a calculating depth that seems to be weighing you, assessing your value, your usefulness, and most frighteningly, your capacity to become a threat. The hand he places on your shoulder is heavy, not in a friendly way, but in a way that marks ownership, a subtle reminder of who really runs this street. You leave his house with a gift, perhaps a box of Cuban cigars or an invitation to his Christmas party, but also with a knot in your stomach. His kindness doesn't feel like a gift, but an investment, an invisible leash he has just placed around your neck. You realize with a creeping chill that being Al Capone's neighbor isn't a blessing. It's an obligation, and the price of his friendship is your silence. The illusion of a peaceful neighborhood shatters suddenly and violently. The good neighbor mask doesn't just fall, it's ripped away, revealing the brutal face of an empire built on blood and fear. The event that cements this new reality in your mind, and in that of the entire nation, occurs on a cold Thursday morning, February 14th, 1929. You first hear about it from the shouts of the paper boys on the corner. Extra massacre in North Clark Street garage. Your neighbor's name isn't officially linked to the crime yet, but an icy terror runs down your spine. You know, the St. Valentine's Day massacre isn't just a news story to you. It's the confirmation of all your darkest suspicions. 7 men, members of Bugs Moran's rival gang, were lined up against a brick wall and gunned down by assassins disguised as police officers. The execution was methodical, merciless, and designed to send an unequivocal message. This wasn't a street brawl. It was an act of corporate warfare, where the tools of the trade were Thompson submachine guns. As the newspapers publish photos of the carnage, you remember the silent figures who enter and leave the house next door, the powerful cars with their engines running. You wonder if the men who pulled the triggers were the same ones you saw unloading crates in the dead of night. The violence that seemed like a distant murmur is now screaming right at your doorstep. This massacre, though the most famous, is just a glimpse into Capone's modus operandi. His rise to power was not an accident, but a systematic campaign of intimidation, corruption, and elimination. His method was terrifyingly effective. He didn't choose his victims at random. He targeted anyone who stood as an obstacle to his monopoly. Bar owners who refused to buy his bootleg liquor, politicians who wouldn't take his bribes, other gangsters who dared to compete on his turf. Capone's signature was the disproportionality of his violence. He didn't just defeat his enemies. He annihilated them in a way so spectacular that no one else would dare challenge him. Urban legends, which you now suspect are terrible truths, circulate through the city. Like the story of the dinner where Capone invited 3 of his own men, whom he suspected of betrayal. In the middle of the meal, after a toast to loyalty, he allegedly took a baseball bat and beat them to death in front of everyone else. True or not, the story served its purpose. It created an aura of savage unpredictability. He could be your best friend or your executioner, and the switch from one to the other could happen in the blink of an eye. The impact of this on your life as a neighbor is direct and paralyzing. Fear becomes the air you breathe. Every newspaper headline about a body found in the Chicago River or an explosion at an illegal brewery reverberates down your street. The sound of the blast that rocked the next neighborhood over last week wasn't an industrial accident. It was the result of an order given by the man who waved to you this morning while watering his roses. While the news reports on another public prosecutor dropping a case against organized crime for lack of witnesses, you understand why. The witnesses disappear, literally. You start to notice the pattern. A strange car parks in front of the house of a neighbor who was seen talking to the police. Days later, the family moves out abruptly without a goodbye, selling their home for a fraction of its value. The silence in the neighborhood becomes heavy, complicit. No one makes eye contact anymore. Casual sidewalk conversations cease. The unwritten rule is clear. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, and for the love of God, you say nothing. Capone's facade as a family man becomes even more sinister. You see him playing with his son in the yard, and the image is no longer heartwarming. It's terrifying. It's the image of a predator in his den, a monster who has mastered the art of camouflage, living a peaceful domestic life just feet from where you and your family sleep. His house is no longer the residence of a wealthy neighbor. It's the embassy of a kingdom of violence, and you are living dangerously within its sovereign territory. The danger of living next to Al Capone wasn't limited to his direct acts of violence. The real terror, the kind that seeped into the soul of the city in your daily life, was the ecosystem of absolute power he built. You begin to understand that the question, "Why doesn't anyone stop him?" has a simple, terrifying answer. Because he owned the people who were supposed to stop him. The law in Chicago was not a shield for its citizens. It was a weapon in Capone's hand. His payroll was more extensive and influential than the city's own. You see it with your own eyes. The police officer who patrols your street, once a guardian of order, now stops in front of Capone's house, not to investigate but to receive a thick envelope, exchanging a respectful nod with the henchman on the porch. You hear stories whispered in bars and barbershops about judges who dismiss cases against Capone's men after receiving a donation for their re-election campaign, or prosecutors who suddenly lose crucial evidence from their offices. The corruption was so blatant, it became part of the urban landscape. The mayor at the time, William Hale "Big Bill" Thompson, was openly allied with Capone, ensuring the municipal apparatus worked to protect the crime syndicate, not to fight it. For you, the neighbor, this meant there was nowhere to run. Calling the police wasn't an option. It was a death risk. You would, in effect, be reporting Capone to Capone's own employees. The sense of isolation is total. The house next door is not just a gangster's home. It's the headquarters of a shadow government, with its own army, its own judicial system, and its own code of laws, where the only law that matters is the will of your neighbor. This institutionalized control generates a climate of fear that poisons the community from the inside out. Fear becomes the social currency. On your street, the once friendly neighborhood disintegrates into a collection of silent islands. People walk with their heads down, avoiding each other's gaze, afraid that a simple greeting could be misinterpreted as an alliance or, worse, as an observation. The unwritten rule of "see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil" becomes a gospel of survival. You learn to ignore the muffled shouts you sometimes hear from the house next door. You learn not to question why your neighbor's garden looks like it was recently dug up and turned over in the middle of the night. You teach your children not to play near that house, not to accept candy or money from the kind man. The fear is so palpable it changes the geography of your own home. You find yourself closing the curtains on the side of the house facing Capone's property, treating the wall that separates you as the border of a hostile country. Paranoia sets in. A car that drives slowly down the street twice is a cause for panic. A phone call with a deadline is a warning. Reporting him wouldn't bring help. It would bring a target on your back and on your family's. You realize that Capone's greatest weapon isn't the machine gun, but the terrified silence of thousands of people like you. A silence he cultivated with the same dedication he gave to his rose garden. To make everything even more confusing and dangerous, the public perception of Capone, fueled by the media, was perilously ambivalent. For every newspaper that called him an arch-criminal, there was another that portrayed him as a charismatic anti-hero, a dapper don who defied a hypocritical government and an unpopular law like prohibition. He was a celebrity. People asked for his autograph on the street. He attended operas, baseball games, and charity events, always surrounded by reporters and photographers. This duality created a paralyzing cognitive dissonance. How could the man who funded soup kitchens for the poor be the same one who ordered cold-blooded massacres? This conflicting public image made the danger even more insidious. It made it difficult for ordinary people to see him for who he truly was. For you, the neighbor, this fame was an extra layer of protection for him and of danger for you. To criticize Al Capone in public was not just dangerous, it was almost unpopular. You would be going against the city's benefactor, the man many saw as a necessary evil, or even a folk hero. You are trapped, not just by physical fear, but by the web of a public narrative that he skillfully wove around himself. You are not just the neighbor of a man, but of a myth. And fighting a myth is a battle lost before it even begins. Al Capone's reign was not just a backdrop of fear. It was a series of volcanic eruptions of violence and corruption that shook Chicago to its foundations. Scandals so audacious, they became legends in real time. You, the neighbor, didn't just hear about them. You felt the tremors. One of the most notorious was the Chicago Beer Wars, a bloody conflict for control of the multi-billion-dollar illegal alcohol market. What were once rivalries transformed into a war of extermination. Your neighbor, Mr. Capone, was the general of one of the armies. The city streets became his battlefield. Drive-by shootings, a tactic perfected by Capone's men, became an almost daily occurrence. You read in the newspapers about the death of Dion O'Banion, the gangster florist, murdered in his own flower shop by Capone's gunmen. Then came the assassination of Jaime Weiss, O'Banion's successor, riddled with bullets in front of the Holy Name Cathedral. Each murder was a public declaration of power, a macabre chess move where the pieces were human lives. For you, this meant that the violence was not contained in dark alleys. It could explode at any moment anywhere, in a barber shop, a restaurant, at the door of a church. The entire city was a war zone, and the enemy's command headquarters was the house next to yours. Capone's audacity reached its peak during the municipal elections of 1924 and 1928, especially in the suburb of Cicero, which he transformed into his personal fiefdom. The events of the 1924 Cicero election became known as one of the most shameful episodes in the history of American democracy. Capone wanted to ensure his puppet candidate won, so he imported hundreds of thugs from Chicago. They didn't just campaign. They kidnapped poll workers, stole ballot boxes, and terrorized voters. Citizens attempting to vote for the opposition candidate were beaten in broad daylight. The local police, mostly on Capone's payroll, stood by with their arms crossed. The situation got so out of control that the Chicago police, in a rare show of force, sent a contingent of 70 detectives to restore order. The result was a mass shootout in the streets of Cicero. Capone's brother Frank was killed in the confrontation. Al's response was furious and immediate. He escalated the violence and his candidate won. For you, the neighbor, this scandal destroyed any remaining shred of hope in law and order. If the democratic process itself could be so openly hijacked and stained with blood by the man living next door, what chance did an ordinary citizen have against him? The Cicero scandal wasn't just about politics. It was proof that Capone could bend the very fabric of society to his will. But perhaps the most chilling scandal was the way Capone dealt with justice when it dared to get close. The case of Assistant State's Attorney William H. McSwiggan was a brutal example. McSwiggan, known as the hanging prosecutor for his tough stance on crime, was seen drinking with Capone and his men in Cicero. Hours later, he was found dead, riddled with machine gun fire. The public outrage was immense. Capone was formally named as a suspect, and a grand jury was convened. It was the first time he faced a murder charge. What happened next was a masterclass in manipulation. Key witnesses disappeared or developed sudden amnesia. Evidence evaporated. Capone, with defiant confidence, appeared before the grand jury, denying everything. With no concrete evidence and with the witnesses terrified, the jury had no choice but to not indict him. Capone walked free, more powerful and arrogant than ever. For you, this was the final, most terrifying lesson. Your neighbor didn't just commit crimes. He had the power to erase the very memory of his crimes from the official record. He could kill a prosecutor and get away with it, laughing at the law. Living next to him wasn't just living near danger. It was living in an alternate reality that he himself wrote, where the truth was what he said it was, and justice was an illusion that could be gunned down on a street in Cicero. Every empire, no matter how powerful, has a crack in its foundation. For Al Capone, the man who controlled a city with violence and bribery, the crack wasn't a rival's bullet or a lieutenant's betrayal, but something far more mundane and, to him, unthinkable, an accountant's ink. Capone's fatal flaw was his ego. He saw himself as untouchable, a ghost to the legal system, as no violent crime could be directly traced back to him. He boasted to newspapers, lived in opulence, and in the process, flaunted a vast income that officially did not exist. While J. Edgar Hoover's FBI tried and failed to pin him to murders and bootlegging, a quiet, stubborn team from the Treasury Department, led by agents like Frank J. Wilson, took a different path. They weren't interested in the machine guns, but in the ledgers. The investigation was a meticulous hunt for financial breadcrumbs. Wilson and his team spent years sifting through records, interrogating shopkeepers, hotel clerks, and bankers, building a case not on who Capone killed, but on the money he spent and never declared. The turning point came from an unlikely source, a ledger seized in a raid on one of Capone's casinos, which detailed payments and profits. It was the smoking gun the law needed, proof that the furniture dealer had a millionaire's income on which he never paid a cent of tax. Capone's arrogance was his undoing. He had built a bulletproof criminal empire, but forgot to make it tax-proof. The capture, when it finally came, was not a dramatic shootout, but the unfolding of a legal process. The formal indictment for tax evasion in 1931 was a shock to the public and perhaps to Capone himself. He tried to use his old tricks, intimidating witnesses, bribing the jury, but this time the system was prepared. Judge James H. Wilkerson, aware of Capone's tactics, switched the jury at the last minute with one from another case, thwarting the bribery attempt. The trial was a spectacle. On one side, the prosecution, meticulously presenting the money trail that linked Capone to an illicit fortune. On the other, Capone himself, sitting in the defendant's chair, his face puffy, his once unshakable confidence draining away with each passing day. The contrast was stark. The man who was the uncrowned king of Chicago, who dined with judges and was cheered on the streets, was now just a defendant, powerless, watching his empire of fear be dismantled by receipts and ledgers. The sentence of 11 years in federal prison was the final blow. For you, the neighbor, seeing the headlines announce his imprisonment is like waking from a long nightmare. The silence on your street, once heavy with fear, now feels lighter, almost hopeful. His departure for the Atlanta penitentiary, and later for the infamous Alcatraz, is not just news, it is your liberation. Capone's final days were a pathetic decline, a dim echo of his former power. In Alcatraz, he was no longer the boss. He was prisoner AZ-85, stripped of his silk suits, his henchmen, and his aura of fear. He was just another man serving time. His old enemies inside the prison despised him, and he was stabbed by another inmate in the yard. But his true executioner was a disease he had contracted years earlier, syphilis. The untreated illness attacked his brain, slowly eroding his mind. When he was finally released for medical reasons in 1939, he was a shell of his former self. He retreated to his Florida mansion, where he spent his last years mentally debilitated, fishing in his swimming pool and having conversations with ghosts from his violent past. He died of cardiac arrest in 1947, not in a blaze of mafia glory, but in his bed, a broken and confused man. The end of Al Capone was not a direct consequence of his most heinous crimes, but of the simple, inescapable truth that no one, not even he, is above all the rules. His fall was a lesson that justice sometimes arrives not in the form of a bullet, but of a pen, and that the most frightening empires can crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. Living next to Al Capone was a brutal lesson that echoes through history. Evil rarely looks like a monster with claws and fangs. Most of the time, it wears a silk suit, smiles, and wishes you a good morning. His story isn't just about a gangster. It's about how power, corruption, and fear can hijack an entire city, turning neighbors into silent accomplices and peaceful streets into war zones. The facade of generosity was just the bait in a deadly trap, and proximity to him wasn't a privilege, but a sentence of perpetual fear. Stories like this remind us that we need to look beyond appearances, question the easy narratives, and understand the dark forces that often hide in plain sight. If you are also fascinated by the darkest corners of history and want to unravel other complex figures who shaped our world, join our community of truth seekers and subscribe to the channel. And speaking of evil that hides in plain sight, the story of Al Capone shows how the violence of an organization can dominate a city. But what about when the terror doesn't come from a gang, but from a single man who turns his own home into a death trap? In our next video, we'll explore the murder castle of America's first serial killer. Click here to discover why you wouldn't survive living next to H.H. Holmes.